we'll preface first. The primary discourse is going to be on the sheep and the goats parable, which is the last parable Jesus gives in a sequence of parables that begin in Matthew 24. And that sequence of parables is given specifically to the disciples after Jesus' last visit to the synagogue. So he's in Jerusalem. He goes to the temple in Jerusalem, the temple now. So the primary point of worship for all Jews in Jerusalem. He's in the temple. He castigates the scribes and the Pharisees, and he ends that discourse that he gives in Matthew chapter 23 with, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how often would I have gathered you like a hen gathers her chicks? And then he says the statement, behold, your house is left unto you desolate. Your house is left unto you desolate. So he gives that casting off message, and then he departs from the temple for the last time. He'll never set foot in the temple again. That's his last message to the nation of Israel and to the political and religious leaders of Israel. And he really didn't care much for politics, remember. He never spoke out against the government, either the Jewish government or the Roman government. But he spared no opportunity to speak out against the religious rulers and leaders of the day, the scribes and the Pharisees. That was what he was concerned with, the spiritual guides of the time in Israel, not the political or social. That was completely off of his radar. He understood that Satan was in full control of those systems, just as he is to this day. Just as he is to this day. Every system of government on the planet is a form of the God of this world's governmental systems. It only matters when it comes to the spiritual, those who claim to speak for God. The Jews only had one path, one course. They had a temple, they had a high priest, they had sacrifices, they had the law, they were given the oracles of God, and so that was Jesus' focal point for his entire ministry. So, as we mentioned, he gives this last discourse and last condemnation of the scribes and the Pharisees, and then he issues that edict that, behold, your house is left unto you desolate. And he leaves the temple grounds. We're setting the stage here for this sheep and the goats parable. If you go to Matthew chapter 24, the very beginning, it says, and Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him to show him the buildings of the temple. So you have to remember this setting that Jesus is in. He just came into Jerusalem a couple of days earlier. And how did he come into Jerusalem? Triumphantly. And what were all the people doing? They're throwing their coats down, they're throwing palms down, they're saying, Hosanna to the Son of David in the highest. He's riding high, and his disciples are all seeing this. They're witnessing this. Even though Jesus said time and time again, he says that he's going to Jerusalem to be killed, to be crucified. It went in one ear and out the other, the disciples, and they're riding this high of Jesus is at the zenith of his popularity coming into Jerusalem. And he gives this desolation message, and they're still deaf to what's going on, even though they're right next to him and traveling with him. And so after he comes out of the temple, they're still thinking back to a couple days ago, that all of Israel is in expectation, and they think, oh boy, it's really exciting now. Things are starting to happen, and we're finally getting somewhere. Israel's finally listening. And so when he leaves the temple after the casting off of Jerusalem, his disciples come and say, you know, look at this. Isn't this beautiful? This is wonderful. And they're on the outside, you know, they're near, probably very close to the Mount of Olives, and they're in that gorgeous environment, and they're still excited. They're still like goose pimples. Everyone's buzzing. Everyone's talking about Jesus, and Jesus tells them before that they're going to be seated on thrones with him. And this is just before the Passover. I mean, literally just like almost probably a day or so, give or take, before the Passover. And then, of course, the betrayal and the crucifixion. And then Jesus lays this on him, because now it's just his disciples that are with him. So they are the recipients of special information that he's not giving to the rest of the nation, just to anybody. He's not speaking willy-nilly, you know, or off the cuff to the general populace. He's speaking to his devoted followers. And Jesus says to these disciples that are all bubbling with excitement, he says, do you see all of this? All this beautiful temple, everything that's happening, all these people that are abuzz. He says, I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. And he must have said it in a way that took the wind out of their sails, that made them stop and go, I didn't expect that response. You know? And it says, as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. So this is that private conversation that they're having. And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, and they said, tell us, how is this going to happen? What's going to happen? Well, you know, and then Jesus goes into a number of different explanations. You're all familiar with Matthew 24 and Matthew 25 about nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and earthquakes and pestilence and famine in different places, and all these are the beginning of sorrows, meaning that all these things that you see, that you're going to experience yourselves, and not just you, but all my disciples down throughout the gospel age, don't get caught up in the moment. Don't get sucked into, hey, look at all this is happening. Is this what the Bible told us? Is this the end times? Are we in the end times? And this is what's happened throughout the entire gospel age. Many Christians, if not most, have felt almost continuously that they've been in the end times. That this is what's been spoken of, because we're watching and we're seeing, but we understand now, 2,000 years later, that many things that had to be in place for the real end times to happen, that Jesus tells us here. He tells us that that day should not come upon you as a thief. And he goes through all of these explanations. They'll deliver you up. You're going to be hated for my name's sake. You know, iniquity will abound and love will wax cold. And the abomination of desolation. And, you know, lest those days be shortened, no flesh would be saved. And then he talks about the tribulation and the darkening of the sun. Talks about the fig tree putting forth its leaves. Of that day and hour no man knoweth. He uses both the picture of Noah, that everything was going on just as it has been until the same day Noah and his family entered into the ark and the flood came. And then he uses Lot. The same day Lot and his family were pulled out of Sodom and Gomorrah, it rained fire and brimstone. Then he talks about this good man of the house. This is something that we misinterpret. It's not Satan. It's not Satan, and that has nothing to do with the binding, and it has nothing to do with anything. It has to do with the expectation that we have that we're not caught unawares. We're not caught by a thief breaking into our house. It has the idea, or the context is that we're ready. We're not caught off guard when these things happen. We're not outside the ark, we're inside the ark. We're not inside Sodom, we're taken out of Sodom. And the same thing with the servant. This is in a general sense, not in a specific sense. And then we get into Matthew 25. So again, this is all, we're laying the groundwork, the context for what Jesus was trying to teach his disciples. And 2,000 years later, what we see, looking at these events, we finally see that, well, okay, these things didn't come to an end in 1914. They're very much continuing on for the last 107 years from that time that the pastor couldn't have possibly seen. But we have a few key things that hadn't happened in the context of these Matthew verses, the fig tree and things like that, that we do see now have happened. And the pastor gave us many clues, but not the answers. So we thought we had the answers back when, because we thought everything would be wrapped up over 100 years ago, but it hasn't. Everyone that was consecrated back in the pastor's day is long since dead and buried. They've gone on to their reward already. So the parables begin in Matthew 25 with the wise and foolish virgins. We're going to bring in many other parables. Wise and foolish virgins, wheat and the tares, Elijah and Elisha, all these different verses that talk about the end times. And there are so many in the scriptures that if you apply them over a vast period of time, that they become neutered. They lose their power. They don't generate a real sense of urgency and expectation. Parable of the talents, all of these things the pastor recognized, and we benefit from that understanding. All of these parables have to do with the gospel age. And they all essentially give us two classes: the faithful servant and the evil servant. The two that are working in the field or at the mill or in the bed. One is taken, another is left. The talents, the parable of the talents. You have ones that use their talents properly and one that hides his talent. Then ultimately we get to the sheep and the goats. When you go down through these various parables and these various pictures, you have an approved class and an informed class, and you have an unfaithful class and a disapproved class in every single parable. Every single one, including the sheep and the goats, it's talking about the gospel age and not the millennial age, not some age to come. It's all the same context in the same way, because once we get it to the end of Matthew 25, we get into Matthew 26, this is when he says, after 2 days is the feast of Passover, and the Son of Man is to be betrayed, to be crucified. And so this is all within Jesus' last week. And Jesus' last week is a microcosm or a picture of the church, the feet members, the church in the flesh at the end of the age, living, that's alive at the time the gospel age closes. That's the important, that's been I'll say a very well understood line of thinking amongst the Bible students. But then we take this one parable at the end of Matthew 25 and we pull it out of context and we stick it into a completely different time frame. So what we're going to do is we're going to go down through the parable. The reason we think it's important is because when it comes to the gathering of the church, when Jesus returns, and we'll look very quickly at 1 Thessalonians 4:16. For the Lord himself shall descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trump of God, and the dead in Christ shall rise first. Then we which are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so shall we ever be with the Lord. There are a few things here. This is the epiphany part. This is the part where he comes to gather. The church is finished. And there is, we know from many other scriptures, some of which we'll get into as we go along in the parable, there is a small time between when the sleeping saints are resurrected and the saints on this side of the veil, as the pastor puts it in one of his comments on the wise and foolish virgins. He says this parable applies to the last generation of the church living at the end of the gospel age. So what we're trying to say here is we're taking many things that we've typically given applications in the past, and we're not changing the application at all. We are changing when these things are applied, and we think the scriptures are going to be, once we get through these, are going to bear that out very clearly. But the pastor gives us certain keys again. These parables deal with the last generation of the church living at the end of the gospel age. So what does that mean? The last generation of the church living at the end of the gospel age.
Got to be alive.
Got to be alive. Got to be alive. So this is the final generation. It's not going to pass on, and there's going to be subsequent generation after generation after generation, as there has been for the last 150 years since the original printing of the Watchtower and the volumes. So what we're taking the pastor, what he said and what he expected at that time, and we're taking it wholesale, and we're saying it didn't belong then, that's manifest, but it does belong now, and that's the important part. So he comes from heaven. Now it says he descends with a shout. What is that shout? Behold the bridegroom. Because what happens in the wise and the foolish virgins? Don't they go out to meet the bridegroom? But what happens? He tarries. It seems like he's, okay, so we're just going to hang out. We don't know where to go, what to do. We're just going to hang out here. Then they hear a shout, behold the bridegroom. That's what wakes them up. That's what wakes them up. And immediately there's this rush to, trim their lamps, and then we have the separation. So you're all familiar. We've gone through the wise and foolish virgins many, many times. But this shout is the behold the bridegroom, and with the voice of the archangel. Isn't that, why does he have the voice of the archangel? It's not to show us that he's Michael. That's irrelevant here. I mean, he comes with the voice of the archangel because who's with him? Myriads and myriads. And if you look at Deuteronomy, it says 10,000 times 10,000. I don't know how good you are at math. That's 100 million. And Jude says he comes with all his holy ones. Now, many of us have misapplied scriptures to the church. The church are not angels. When you look at the parable of the wheat and the tares, what do you have? Jesus spells all of that out very clearly. You've got wheat, you've got tares, you've got the field, you've got reapers, you've got those who sow in the field, at the beginning, and then you've got this time frame, and then you've got the adversary that comes in, and so you're all familiar with the wheat and the tares parable. But what does he say? What's the wheat? Children of the kingdom. And what does he say about the reapers? This is something, I want to call it a little bit of an obfuscation, because a lot of times in that picture, in that parable, there's no room for the wheat to also be the reapers. We're not reaping ourselves. This is the close of the age. At the end of the age, when they grow together, Jesus is really specific in that parable. He says the reapers are the angels. That's not a code word for church. The wheat are the children of the king. The wheat is the church. And, ostensibly the great multitude as well. But primarily we think it's referring to the church. The reapers are the angels. So we're going to go through, and we're going to go through the parable itself first in Matthew 25, beginning with verse 31. Matthew 25, beginning with verse 31. And I'm going to go ahead and read it. When the Son of Man shall come in his glory with all the holy angels with him, Then shall he sit upon the throne of his glory, and before him shall be gathered all nations, and he shall separate them one from another, as a shepherd divideth his sheep from the goats. And he shall set the sheep on his right hand, but the goats on the left. Then shall the king say unto them on his right hand, Come ye, blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungered, and you gave me meat. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. Naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came unto me. Then shall the righteous answer him, saying, Lord, when saw we thee and hungered, and fed thee, or thirsty, and gave thee drink? When saw we thee a stranger, and took thee in, or naked, and clothed thee? Or when saw we thee sick, or in prison, and came unto thee? And the king shall answer and say unto them, Verily I say unto you, inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of these, my brethren, ye have done it unto me. Then he shall say also to them on the left hand, Depart from me, ye cursed, into everlasting fire, prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungered, and you gave me no meat. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. I was a stranger, and you took me not in. Naked, and ye clothed me not. Sick, and in prison, and ye visited me not. Then shall they also answer him, saying, Lord, when saw we thee an hungered, or athirst, or a stranger, or naked, or sick, or in prison, and did not minister unto thee? Then shall he answer them, saying, Verily I say unto you, inasmuch as ye did it not to one of the least of these, you did it not to me. And these shall go away into everlasting punishment, but the righteous into life eternal. So that's the parable. I'll say there's a standard Bible student application and understanding in the kingdom age. We think this applies specifically in the context, as we said before, with all the other parables, that you have two classes. One class is approved, one class is disapproved, and this is a gospel age when the Lord comes. So how do we arrive at this? What are the scriptures that as we go through one by one? So when the Son of Man shall come in his glory, and all the holy angels with him, then he shall sit upon the throne of his glory. Every other scriptural citation that uses that terminology, the Bible students universally put during the gospel age. But this is they're all gospel age related. This one parable is the one that we take and we put it into the kingdom age. And even the pastor says, if we do this, this makes it the only parable Jesus ever gave that is a kingdom age picture. So that right there sends up a little bit of a question mark in our minds. And then we look at the context that we just put it in. We look at how everything just falls into place. But when we look at, we just discussed in Matthew 13 that the enemy that sowed the tares is the devil, the harvest is the end of the world, and the reapers are the angels. And we've said it before, in every case that we have here, the holy ones that are mentioned in Jude, I think it's verse 14, and the reapers are the angels, and just on and on and on, and we'll get into a number of scriptures. It shows that the angels are actually play an integral part in the harvest. They're the ones, remember the book of Revelation, where it says, hold back the four winds until what? Until the servants are sealed in their forehead. In the scriptures that we just read, there's a corresponding Mark chapter 13, where it says, then he shall send his angels and shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from the uttermost part of the earth to the uttermost part of heaven. That's Mark 13, verse 27. And when we think about exactly what happens during this specific time frame, remember where this is. This is the final parable Jesus gives. This is it. This is the very last one that in this temple scene that he comes out of, and it's on the tail end of all these other parables. And then we have the Passover and the betrayal and the garden scene and the crucifixion. So when the Son of Man shall come in his glory with all the holy angels with him, if we look at it from the context of 1 Thessalonians 4 verse 16, that we have the shout, behold the bridegroom. We have the voice of the archangel, which is the command, send in the reapers, which are the angels, because he's the archangel. He comes back with this myriads of myriads. So let's look at Jude, verse 14. And Enoch also, the seventh from Adam, prophesied of these, saying, behold, the Lord cometh with 10,000s of his saints. This is the same, I'll say, let's call it venue, if you want to call it that, as in Daniel chapter 7, verses 9 and 10, where he says, I beheld till the thrones were cast down, and the Ancient of Days did sit, whose garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was like a fiery flame, and his wheels as burning fire. And a fiery stream came forth from before him. Thousands before him, thousands ministered unto him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. And these pictures, especially in Jude, where it talks about the Lord cometh with 10,000s of his saints to execute judgment upon all, this is exactly the same way it is also in Colossians and Corinthians, and 2 Thessalonians 1:7. And to you who are troubled, rest with us when the Lord Jesus shall be revealed from heaven with his mighty angels in flaming fire, taking vengeance on them that know not God. Verse 32. And before him shall be gathered all nations. Who has their computer open? What's the word for nations?
Ethnos.
Ethnos. And why is that important? Or is it important? Because typically we think about nations as what we think of nations today. When you hear the word nations, you think about, the United States and all the United Nations that we have. But this gives a different idea. It's the people. It's not the nations, or it's the people under systems, under government. And part of the end of this parable shows a harsh end, that depart from me, ye wicked, into the fire that was prepared for the devil and his angels. That sounds an awful lot like, if you're going to depart into the fire that's prepared for the devil and his angels, that's a finality. That's a second death. But let's look at, in the context of Babylon that's destroyed, what happens to her? Isn't she also destroyed forever? The smoke of her burning arises forever and ever. But what is that? Is that the people in Babylon, or is that the system? It's the system. So the same thing here with the terminus that happens to this group. It's not individuals, it's these systems, let's call them Christian systems. Because remember, Jesus just condemned in Matthew 23, inside the temple, the scribes and the Pharisees, and just talked about the destruction and overthrow of Jerusalem. And now the same system in antitype that we have today, though the professed Christians, the tare class, the tares that are gathered together to be burned, they're destroyed as a system, not individually. And that's kind of the hang-up, because it sounds very personal in the parable when it begins to talk about, when did we see these things ever happening to you and we didn't do anything? That's when Jesus says, as you did it to these ones, my brethren, so, or didn't do it, as the case might be. So he's separating the classes, the Lord's goat and the scapegoat, the sheep in this case, and the goats. These systems, the wheat class and the tare class, the wise virgins and the foolish virgins. He's separating the systems and the system of things and this entire world that does not include the church, because the church is separate from the world. That's what's being judged and destroyed, not the individuals. This is not a parable where we narrow it down and we focus on the individuals. And that's where we get caught up into this end of the kingdom age thinking, because when we begin to apply it to individuals, we understand that the world of mankind gets their opportunity in the kingdom age. But the reasoning that's used to apply this in the kingdom age is because it seems to be an individual judgment. The individual judgment comes in Revelation. Remember in Revelation it talks about the books were opened? And so you've got these books in Revelation chapter 21 that are open, and these are the books of the deeds of the people, and then you've got the book of life. And then ultimately it gets to the end where it says, I think it's actually Revelation chapter 20, the end of chapter 20, where it says, and everyone whose name was not written in the book of life was thrown into the lake of fire. And then it says, and hell and death were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death. So that's the individual judgment rendering at the end of the kingdom age. This has nothing to do with the individual judgment of actual people throughout the kingdom age. This has to do specifically, because what does he say in verse 34? The king says to those on his right hand, come ye blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. Well, what does that sound like? Inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. Who inherits the kingdom? The church. And how do we know that? If you are Christ's, then are you
Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise.
And heirs according to the promise. Heirs according to the promise. What does Jesus say about in my Father's house? And I wouldn't tell you if it wasn't so. And what does he say? I go and prepare a place for you. So the only people who are promised this inheritance, and that it was set up from the foundation of the world, are the children of the kingdom, are the same as, what does it say that the wheat represents? The wheat are the children of the kingdom. And so, who receives an inheritance? Children receive an inheritance. You don't get an inheritance unless you are a child of God. And we're all brethren, and we all receive this inheritance. It's promised to us. It's now our birthright, literally, our birthright. Because now we are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. And when you think about from the foundation of the world, typically that often refers to Jesus, the Lamb of God, slain before the foundation of the world. But what do we become, especially if we are of this class? Don't we, everything Jesus receives, don't we have a share? Aren't we promised a share in that? Aren't we called the Christ, head and body? What does Jesus say? Remember the Apostle Paul, when he was Saul on the road to Damascus. What did he say to Saul?
Why persecutest thou me?
Me. But Saul never persecuted Jesus directly, right? And isn't it interesting that Paul, who we get that account in the book of Acts, and then later on in Thessalonians and in other places, when he says specifically, like in Romans, he's the same author of these books, Thessalonians, Romans, Timothy. He uses what Jesus told him, why persecutest thou me? And Saul was perplexed as well. Well, who are you? I'm Jesus. He made the connection instantly. Now in Romans, Paul tells them, he says, When one of us is in prison, we're to actually think about ourselves as though we're in prison too. When a part of our body, one of our brethren is going through affliction, we endure that affliction with them. And so when you read through the verse 35 onward, when he talks about when I was in prison, when I was hungry, when I thirsted, etc., Paul specifically links those scriptures he's talking about to his experience in Damascus, which links back to what Jesus is saying here, that as you do to one of these, you're doing it directly to me, or as you don't do to one of these, you're not doing it directly to me. So we want to be very clear that it's classes. There's a tare class. There's a wheat class. There's a wise virgin class and a foolish virgin class. All of these, there's a faithful servant class and an evil servant class. There's an unfaithful steward class and a faithful steward class. So these are all classes. So there's no reason for us when we get to this last parable to suddenly peel it apart and say, oh, this is individual judgment. It's not. It's not individual judgment. It's class judgment. So the difference that he gives in the sheep and the goats is their behavior as brethren toward, or as professed brethren toward one another. Now we'll bring out a little bit, and we'll just read on this, prepared for you from the foundation of the world. In Ephesians chapter 1, verses 4 and 5, he says, according as he hath chosen us in him before the foundation of the world, that we should be holy and without blame before him in love, having predestinated us. And that's that whom he did foreknow, he did predestinate. Again, as a class, we are, prospectively, in this as wheat in the field, as wise virgins, as faithful to the talent we've been given, and as faithful stewards, and ultimately as sheep. All of these are showing us specifically the different attitudes of what's going to happen at the very end of the age. Not in the kingdom age, but this is for the development of the church. It doesn't do anything for our development in the gospel age if this is specifically a millennial age parable. And we could go into, well, does any of this fit the reasoning for what makes a sheep and a goat? Does it fit during the millennial age? How can you see Jesus' brethren in prison or hungering or thirsting? Is any of that going to actually occur during the millennial age? No. So it has to occur during the gospel age. And anyone who is not spirit begotten during the gospel age is not on trial right now, even though we do understand that they will, the Lord says, vengeance is mine, I will repay, but not with this idea or thought of second death at the end. So someone who does not care for one of the Lord's people now during the gospel age is not going to get necessarily on that merit alone second death in the millennial age. Does that make sense? So it's a little bit wordy, but. And again, on this inheritance part, back in Ephesians 1:11, in whom we also have obtained an inheritance, being predestinated according to the purpose of him who worketh all things after the counsel of his own will. So the point that the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world, that's always been the promise, and that's always been the plan. The plan's never changed. So the plan was always, before the Lamb of God was slain, the plan was always to have this specific divine plan, the permission of evil, the redemption of Adam, this bride class for his son, and this ultimately this class who God in the ages to come will work through in the entire universe for all creation and for all eternity that we're aware of. He's got Jesus the head and 144,000 his body. They will be the instrument that Jehovah uses for, as far as we know, all eternity throughout the universe. Because what's this universe here for? If he created not the earth in vain, but made it to be inhabited, well, what does that make all the other planets? So we've got a universe to deal with for all eternity. What does he say? It is the Father's good pleasure to what? To give you the kingdom. Well, it's not just the kingdom on earth. It's not just the kingdom on earth. Now, this parable is talking about initially the end of the gospel age, primarily, and it says he comes in glory and sits upon his throne. Well, meaning that he's doing what?
Judging.
He's judging, he's reigning. This is the kingdom that was given to him, but it's given to us because, again, we're heirs. But to focus just on the 1,000 years is a big mistake. It's short-sighted. We get to reign as kings and priests in all the earth for the 1,000 years, right? That we're told in Revelation. That's very clear. But it's what comes next. That's the grand plan in operation. He's got Jesus and his bride, the 144,000, to now go throughout the entire universe and make it inhabited, as it were. That's the big, it all starts here, this little ball that we're on right now, the entire plan, but the rest of the universe is the big plan for the church, for his son, Jesus, and for the church. It's like a gift.
Brother Brendan, just in that vein, as 1,000 years is as one day with the Lord, then with us too, we make our calling election, that 1,000 years will go like that.
Let's think about, just briefly, Revelation chapter 7, in this great multitude. And we'll say it again, because I think the great multitude is pictured throughout most of these parables that are given in Matthew 24 and 25 as a very undesirable class, but ultimately in Revelation chapter 7 we're shown they come through the great tribulation, and what do? Wash their robes. And it's also like Jude. What does Jude say? Plucking them out of the fire, hating even the garment. Well, spotted by the flesh. Well, what garment? That robe, right? And then what do we have as a picture in the Old Testament about how this class is dealt with? We brought it up very quickly. It's their goat. Not unironically, by the way, the scapegoat. And how's the scapegoat dealt with? First, let's ask the question, is it sacrificed?
It was out in the wilderness to get rid of the flesh.
So it's not sacrificed. It's brought out, turned over to Azazel, the hand of the fit man. So we liken it to the scripture in the New Testament that talks about being turned over to Satan for the destruction of the flesh. It's for the benefit of this class that they're destroyed in the flesh. Their flesh is destroyed. Because that the spirit might be saved, is what it says. The spirit might be saved. So the reason we're bringing this up is in Revelation chapter 7, it talks about this class that goes through the Great Tribulation. Are we in the Great Tribulation? Has that hit yet? No. Because if it did, you'd know it. It's very clear when a cataclysmic event happens in your life, you're not wondering about it because you're in the middle of it. You understand what's going on. But what does it say about this great multitude? First, it's called the great multitude. But then it goes on and it says of what? Of every kindred and tongue and people, etc. And that no man could number. Well, we have to ask ourselves, where do they come from? I mean, Revelation tells us they come from all over the world. They're literally every country, potentially. Sister Bernice.
They're brethren that didn't make their calling and election sure, but made a consecration anyway, and didn't live up to their word.
And who else is that pictured by? There's another individual in the Old Testament. Lot. This Lot class that's pulled out against his will, by the way, right at the end, just before Sodom is destroyed. But when we read these scriptures and we see, okay, they've got to go through the Great Tribulation. They're this class talked about in Jude. They're this class talked about as the scapegoat. And isn't it interesting that in the Levitical sacrifices, the Day of Atonement sacrifices, it says something very particular. It said when Aaron, the high priest, when he had made an end of reconciling, so the bullock was offered, the ram was offered, and the Lord's goat was offered. And it says when all those sacrifices were done, then he takes the scapegoat and goes through that, confesses the sins, and leads them by the hand of the fit man, etc. The point is that the sacrifice of the Lord's goat is finished. All the sacrificing is done when the scapegoat is dealt with. Meaning, antitypically, what's finished, what's done here? The church is done. The church is done, the complete. So, back to Revelation chapter 7, this huge class that no man can number, of every kindred and tongue and nation and people that come through the Great Tribulation, where do they come from? Well, first off, let's ask, is there any dissent or difference of opinion that this represents a spirit-begotten class running for the high calling? Does anyone not think the great multitude is a spirit-begotten class?
JWs.
The JWs?
Yeah, but for
But yeah,
if many are called, but few are chosen.
it seems very, very clear, many are called, few are chosen. It seems very clear that this is a spirit-begotten class, which means that, and it's a big one. It's not a little one. And we're getting to a point in a very roundabout way here that we can be ourselves, as Bible students, can be guilty of this goat-like behavior in Matthew 25. If we discount that, well, you can't have a relationship with God, you're in a nominal system. You've got nominal doctrines all over you. You're nominal. So therefore, we, in a sense, subconsciously or consciously, I'll say, shut up our bowels of mercy toward those in the dreaded nominal systems. Now, I'm not saying run out into the nominal systems and try to help everybody you can find. It's not what I'm saying. But it is an attitude problem that we can have, that can manifest itself as they're on the outside, they're not in my circle. I also don't want to turn a blind eye or shut up my bowels of mercy to the brethren that we do see throughout the world that are being persecuted, that are being put to death for their stance, that are could wind up being more approved of by God. If we have the improper attitude toward those of like precious faith and that they're spirit begotten and running for the prize of the high calling, then we could be guilty of this goat attitude, that we see things and we dismiss it because they're not part of our club. Does that make sense? Am I losing anybody here? Okay. And by the way, Hebrews 13, 1 through 3, let brotherly love continue. Be not forgetful to entertain strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. And of course, that's hearkening back more to I think Abraham and others. Remember them that are in bonds as bound with them, and them which suffer adversity as being yourselves also in the body. Meaning that if they're suffering adversity, you're feeling, like literally, we have that trite saying, I feel your pain. But I mean, that's really a thing with brethren. When we see a brother or sister struggling and just having a or under tremendous trials or afflictions or whatever, do we feel, really feel for them? Verse 40, when this question, hey, when did we see all these things happening to you? We don't recall seeing you. And he says, inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of these, my brethren, you've done it unto thee. What's the least of these?
Well, as far as the parable goes, it looks like he's talking about the sheep are his brethren. He's talking about the least of these other sheep.
Yes. And that goes all the way back to, why persecutest thou me? And remember, he says in other places, if you offend one of these little ones, you're doing it to me.
Yeah, I was just thinking, as her other sheep I have, which are not of his fold, them also I must bring.
Yeah.
So when he was talking to them, he could say that because nobody had been invited in yet. And they had to understand there was going to be more than just them, more than just that Jewish nation that was being brought forth at that time. Who had they accepted, we wouldn't even have this conversation right now. But other sheep I have, which are not of this fold, is what I'm thinking. The least of these are. And we have a habit of, like you said, of not really looking at that in the manner in which we should.
I think it's some of both. I think Sister Sonia brings up a good point, but I think it also goes to exclusivity. We can't, and you touched on that earlier, we can't think of ourselves as this exclusive group, but we also can't take those within our group and put them up on a pedestal. I mean, it's not an issue for those that are well known among the Bible students to receive attention. It's kind of a natural thing to happen. But what we need to do is we need to look at the ones that need to just be touched upon. Need a kind word or hey, what's going on? Or look for those that are on the edges, on the outside looking in, or on the edges looking in because they have an interest but are maybe too shy, too bashful, or don't feel like they could, come in. For whatever reason, we need to look to extend a hand to them as well.
So it gets back to, who are the sheep? Who are the sheep? And
Sheep are the one that hear the shepherd's voice.
sheep are the one that hear the shepherd's voice. And in every single time, and there's a nice list here, every time the word sheep is used, it's always referring to the Lord's people. His sheep, the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Behold, I send you forth as sheep amongst wolves. I will smite the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But he that entereth in by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. And the sheep hear his voice, and calleth his own sheep by name, and leadeth them. So sheep, 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 sheep. This is, as far as any other scriptures that you're looking at, I think it's very peculiar that we've got tares, we've got goats, we've got the ones that are not taken, the two grinding together, the two walking together, the two working the field together, the two in the bed together, one's taken, the other's left. And throughout this whole process, the king, it's the shepherd, it's the reapers that make the decision on who's who. It's not us. We don't have I don't know about you, but when I consecrated, no one appeared to me and said, here's your little flock detector, here's your Holy Spirit detector, so you'll know, who's who. We don't have that ability. And as soon as we take that, and I don't think anyone does, like, overtly says, I know, but we do either subconsciously or indirectly, by implication. We say things. And by doing that, we are, in effect, making judgment where we have no business to be making judgment. Not in this flesh. That's the last thing we have that we're given the authority to do. You've got a relationship, you don't. Because you think differently than me, it means you're on a lower, and we manifest that even amongst ourselves. So for instance, going through Matthew 24 and 25, it's very clear to me what's being talked about in all these parables. But I've seen in the, now it's been over 30 years since I've been in, and many of you here have been, well, some of you anyway, have been consecrated longer than I have. We're really good parrots. We really are. And because a lot of times we just, a parrot, you can teach that thing to say whatever you want, good or bad.
Mm-hmm.
It'll just,
Spit it out.
yeah, it just does its thing, it just does, it doesn't know what the meaning of the words are, and that's the problem. And I remember I've heard many things, and I adopted, because of whose mouth it came out of, I just assumed, I didn't make it my own. And even then, we can say, well, I made it my own. Well, did you really? I mean, really, did you really? Or did you say, okay, I've been given this premise, let me go ahead and prove this premise to myself? Rather than saying, no, let's find out, like the Bereans, if what he's saying is actually true. Because the truth will always withstand scrutiny. So, I've heard things, well, if you don't believe X, you can't be of the little flock. And we've heard, if you don't believe Jesus is reigning, you can't be of the little flock. If you don't believe this doctrine or that doctrine or this facet of chronology or that facet of chronology, you can't be of the little flock. We've heard that, and I've parroted that, and I've said it myself because I didn't, and I wish I could go back and take those words back. But here, if we were, for instance, there is a standard understanding about this parable, and some would not appreciate there being like a different understanding put forth that no, this does belong in the kingdom age. Well, no, it doesn't. Just like these other, the good man of the house, that's not Satan. That's that's not about the binding of Satan. That's specifically in this context about being prepared. If you're prepared for a robber that's coming in your house, if you know he's coming, it's going to be a different story rather than you being sound asleep. The whole point is being asleep at the time of the break-in. That's the point of that, the Matthew 24 parable. So that's the same thing here with the sheep and the goats. This is specifically talking about when he comes to make up his jewels. This is the epiphany period, when he comes with his holy angels, who are really angels, as it is in the wise and foolish virgins, and as it is in the wheat and the tares. All of these things happen at a specific time point, but the sheep and the goats is on that same, it's in the same context, it's using the same terminology, it's showing the same two classes, it's showing, everything's the same about this sheep and goats parable. And so there's no reason to say, well, it appears to be the only parable that belongs to the kingdom age, because of the finality of the punishment for the goat class at the end of the parable. They go in, they depart into the fire prepared for the devil and his angels. Well, once you realize it's not individuals, it's a system or a class, just like the tares are not individuals, it's the systemic, representation of who they are. They're fake wheat, but it's a class. It's not, it's not individuals. Once you get over that hurdle, it fits perfect. We don't have to make all kinds of gyrations and try to drive square pegs into round holes, doctrinally speaking, when you see it for what it really is. So the bottom line is, it's a gospel age parable. It's right at the end of the age. It's exactly in line with the wheat and the tares. This is the one parable that gives us an insight into what makes the sheep class a sheep class. When did we see these things? If you were to sum up what makes the sheep sheep in this particular parable, what is it?
Love of the brethren.
Love of the brethren. Love of the brethren. And isn't it a miracle that right after this comes Passover, and then only in the book of John he records 4 or 5 consecutive chapters from when they leave the upper room till they reach the brook Kidron, when Jesus goes into the mount to pray, Gethsemane, what's the last download Jesus gives the church? And again, you look, John 14 through 18, I think it is. It's all red letter. It's all red letter in your red letter Bibles. What is the focus on those 4 chapters that Jesus is doing nothing but speaking? Sister Breeze.
He told them to love one another as I have loved you.
Love of the brethren.
That's
Love of the
his,
brethren.
that was his focus.
And what did the pastor say? He thought the final test at the end of the age was going to be?
Love.
Love of the brethren. You know, love. You know, that it's not coincidental that we were given this the very last parable Jesus gives before his crucifixion is on love of the brethren. You know, that's what makes us sheep. And how do we know we've passed from death unto life?
It's because we love him.
Because we have the love of the brethren.
That's right.
So again, not a kingdom age picture, not intended for the kingdom age, not intended to be applied to the world of mankind. It's intended specifically, and it's very clear once you get it, that it's intended specifically to let us know who our brethren really are. We can, by their fruits ye shall know them. So we should be able to discern who are our true brethren, whether they're of this fold or of another fold, like Sony said. I have sheep that are not of this fold, and he has plenty of them. And we'll just say one last thing. What did God tell Elijah up on Mount Horeb?
I was just thinking of that.
Yeah.
Okay, Sister Karen, it's
There's
your
7,000 that you don't know about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Elijah's like, it's only me, and they want me dead too. And God says, essentially, you don't know what you're talking about. You think you know. You're certain. When Elijah said that, he had no doubt he was it. He was it. And God tells him, I got 7,000. Not 7 or 70 or 700. I got 7,000 that haven't bowed the knee. So, we should be of the same mentality. As soon as we start thinking we're hot stuff and we're it, God says, you don't know what you're talking about. I got way more than you could possibly imagine. And they were in Israel, by the way. They weren't in the 2-tribe kingdom. They weren't in Judah and Benjamin. They were in the 10-tribe kingdom. So you got to keep that in mind. They didn't have a temple. They didn't have a priesthood. It was all Baal worship. It was all Jezebel and Ahab. I got 7,000 in that condition. Brother Brian.
I think that's another important message too. Here's somebody who God was working directly with, who was giving very strong messages to people, and you can see how he would have felt, entitled's not the right word, but felt like he had an inside track. I'm working with the main guy, and I think that's something we have to be careful of too, as things are revealed to us, as we start to deepen our knowledge of truth. We need to see it as an increased responsibility and not as a class privilege.
Yeah. So Sonny.
Yeah. Wasn't he the one that had his servant Hophni and they were down there and he thought that everybody was coming against him and he told him he prayed and told him to go look again and then he saw all that is around it, Yeah, so
Yeah.
It's amazing what we see when we look naturally and not spiritually.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. Open your eyes and look again. Boom. So.
I was just thinking about, because the love of the brethren at the end is such an important thing, and the fact is that brethren are going to be deceived and turn on other brethren. And that's a sad thing, but that's why we're pushing the love of the brethren, so that you don't do that, but it is going to happen.
Yeah, it's we kind of and I want to be really, really careful about saying it, but we've kind of seen a little glimmer of that in the recent, events that have happened and everything. And it's unfortunate that that's going to happen, and we got, amazingly, even though Peter denied Jesus, which I think is a picture of that, not the Judas type. The Judas is, that betrayal is a different thing, but as Peter's denial of Jesus shows that Jesus, if he represents, like, the feet members of the little flock in that picture, then we got to love them too. Obviously we know Jesus never stopped loving Peter, even when he saw his. So, lovest thou me?
Just going back to Elijah, at that point, he hadn't even met Elisha or the sons of the prophets.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, and we've mentioned it before, and this is the comfort of giving a discourse to your own ecclesia, is that it's, from everything we can tell, scripturally speaking, and typically speaking, we're still at Horeb. That whole interchange, we don't think the wise and foolish virgins have started. We don't think wheat and the tares haven't been gathered up yet, and certainly the wheat hasn't been gathered out of the world yet. For that, we're very certain of. So Elijah and Elijah aren't walking together. The separation of the wise and foolish virgins hasn't happened. So many things. The four winds haven't been loosed yet. The servants haven't been sealed in their forehead yet. So, and in my personal estimation, the actual harvest of the wheat from the earth has not begun yet, because you don't sow while you're reaping. We're still sowing right now. We're still doing a sowing work, even though it's the very end. So there's a lot of things, but we don't change those pictures. We're keeping the pictures the same. We're just saying, oh, it didn't start at this date or at this date. It's still a future picture. All of these pictures start falling in very nicely when you realize that, oh, okay, well, the timing was off, but the pictures and the understanding is right.
Well, at some point, I would love to have a discussion, maybe this is for fellowship, on the practical aspects of the sheep, as far as feeding when they're hungry, or giving drink, or clothing, or
when he was a stranger, took them in.
Yeah, what does that mean from a spiritual perspective on a practical level?
Bernice?
Well, we have to remember that there's kind of like three segments. There's the little flock, you've got the great multitude, and then there's a betrayal class as well, which is at the end. And we're told about that because of the Judas betrayal. So he's included in that because it separates these entities that, what Sister Carol was just saying. At the end, there is going to be that element, especially in this world as we see it today. We see things in this world that we never saw, I never saw before, to the point where I actually feel like I'm living on a foreign planet.
Well, look at it, the parable of the talents.
Yeah.
Two of them are faithful, and one of them is called a wicked and slothful servant, weeping and gnashing of teeth. Because why? Because he did nothing. It's not like he did something bad. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
He did nothing. And what happens here with the goat class? It's not that they do something bad or evil. He doesn't say, you're the ones that did the persecuting. You're the ones that did the jailing. You're the ones that, all you did was you saw and you did nothing. So it's the pattern of the one who buried, he did nothing with his talent. The goats, they see and they do nothing. And that is particularly a harsh condemnation on both of them. He says, wicked and slothful servant, you'll be, and it says, take him and cast him into outer darkness where there shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. The whole point is well, what did he do? What did he do that deserved that? He did nothing. And the goats, what did they do that deserved that destruction? They did nothing,
The
Sister Karen.
foolish virgins also kind of did nothing because they weren't prepared.
They weren't prepared. They had to go out and get prepared. And then they came back, and the harsh language is, I never go away. I never knew you. So
Yeah, I think that means he never knew him as brethren. I mean,
certainly as his bride, wife,
Yeah.
whatever. Yeah.
But still, you still have to keep yourself in the love of God. Some of us just grumpy old people, and you know, it's easy to point out somebody else's faults and stuff, and then you end up winding up with yourself in a bad situation too. So you gotta balance all these things in your life together, and make sure that you're just being loving, and you're being kind, that you're following the tenets that He set for us. And yes, there are requirements. When we read it, there's all kinds of requirements for us to follow. And if we don't do it specifically the way that that He desires for us to do it, we go our own way, and we can be just like the people that we're talking about. Old stinky goats. Nothing against your goats.
Yeah.
They stink.
They stink. Anyway, but
Well-
we can be just like that and think that we're not. No, it's just that whole thing about love is the key. And I just stick to that.
Pigs don't know pigs stink.
I hope I don't know your pigs. I ain't coming over there to smell them.
Well, it is funny how we can so clearly see the providence and the problems with other people, but completely. I just love that, that Kurt Russell 19 hockey team movie. Hey, what are you complaining about his game for? Should be worrying about your own game. Got plenty there to keep you busy. That was classic. So, all right, are we good? Any other last comments? We'll just close here.